Hey guys, my guest tonight, author Craig Bryant, is going to share stories of ghosts, witches, and dark beings in the county of Lancashire, England. See you in about 5 minutes. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust. Turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing? I hope you said great. Another day, another day. Wow, we got a great show for you today. My name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host for the next hour, and I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento, California. We are 45 strong up and down the state of California, which means if you have a paranormal need or you think you might have a paranormal need, we can get to you. It might take us a while because the state's an awfully big state, but we will make it a point to come out and assist you any way we can. Anyway, just a quick reminder, if you're watching from Facebook today and you like what you see, please be sure to hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please be sure, let me get this moved over a little bit. Please be sure to hit that follow button. And you can either follow my personal page or you can follow the California Haunts Ghostly Events page. And if you're watching from YouTube, there's my direction. I did it. First try. If you're watching from YouTube, there's that little ghost in the bottom right-hand corner on your screen, and click on that, and a red subscribe button will pop up. And if you haven't done so already, please be sure to subscribe. I have over 490 videos sitting over there, all different topics, and I think you'll find something that you like. And of course, as you're watching this, if you like what you see, please hit the like button or whatever reaction button you want to hit. Just be nice. Okay, well, if you want to continue to follow me, I'm also on Instagram, and I'm under Ghosty Gal on Instagram. I'm also over at TikTok under California Haunts, which is all lowercase, and of course, Twitter under Cal Haunts. I'm excited today for this guest because I was in England a couple of times, and my cousins, in their infinite wisdom, took me to haunted castles and stuff and all that. And let me tell you, I'm going to tell you something. There's some stories over there. I've been ghost hunting for 25 years here in the States. And when you go to England and Scotland and those areas, it's a totally different ballgame. The ghosts over there have deep, 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 deep stories to tell. And there's just so much history over there and so much heartache and everything that went on. And so there's a lot of stories to tell about ghosts and witches and everything over there. And I tell you, a lot of those stories will curl your toes. They'll curl your toes. So my guest tonight, author Craig Bryant, has stories to tell, and that's what we're going to talk about. Okay? All right, well, let me bring him in, and away we go. Good evening, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm fantastic, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming on. Tell me about you, sir.
Okay, well, I live in the northwest of England, so to make it a little bit easier to find roughly where I live near a place called Pendle Hill, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point during this chat. Mm-hmm. If you look for the city of Manchester and sort of go about 25 miles due north, that's roughly where I live. It's in a county called Lancashire. It's quite rural where I live. It's a beautiful part of the country. It rains a lot, so it's very green. We have some fantastic landscapes around here, and obviously an awful lot of history. Ghost stories about witches, all sorts of stuff. I'm an author. I've written 2 books. I also have my own podcast, which is called Paranormal Pendle. And I also have a website as well, which I can give you the website address at the end of the video. Absolutely. And I've also done a few investigations as well, but I'm not really an investigator as such. I'm more of a sort of collector of stories. I'm a interested person in lots of unexplained things.
Absolutely, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm fascinated about the ghosts over there because, like I said in the intro, I think it's a different. I mean, yeah, we get the sorrowful ghosts and stuff here, but I think because of the history you guys have had, I think your ghostly activity is a lot more intense than what we have here.
That's probably the case. Yeah, I mean, we do have obviously 2,000 years of history, probably more than that. But certainly since the the Norman conquest in 1066, we've got 1,000 years of history there, which, you know, we've seen some ups and downs over the years, and you know, we have a lot of very old buildings, a lot of old castles, a lot of old family homes, big family homes that the landowners, you know, the rich people who used to run the country, and some would say probably still do, used to own, and in fact some of them are still lived in, and so because of the history, and you know, because of the length of time that a lot of these places have been around, we do seem to have an awful lot of very haunted places, and Lancashire itself is an interesting county because there is a lot of history in Lancashire. It goes back a long way. You know, like I say, about at least 1,000 years. There's been people living and initially farming in this area, and then of course it was really where the Industrial Revolution started. We had the cotton industry, and you know, that sort of drove all the industrial revolution. So really, Lancashire and cities such as Manchester and Liverpool, which are in this area, were really the sort of cradle of the Industrial Revolution. So there was also a lot of history involved in that. There's a lot of strife and a lot of, you know, personal difficulties for people as they sort of moved from being, you know, rural farmers into the big cities and worked in the industry.
Can you tell me a couple stories? Obviously, you've written these books, and how long did it? First off, how long did it take you to start researching this stuff, and what got you into it?
Well, the first book really is a collection of stories that are my own personal experiences, and also experiences of friends and family, and people that I'd sort of met along the way whilst I was researching the books. So there are two books. That the one that's on the screen at the moment is the second book that I wrote.
Sorry about that. There we go.
No, that's absolutely fine. Oh yeah, there we go.
It flipped it on me.
There we go. Yeah,
I gotta go to feed a minute. It flips it on me. There you go.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that's the first book that I wrote, and it's, as I say, it's really a collection of stories. I can give you a couple. The reason why it's called the Shadow Man of Accrington. Accrington is a small town not too far away from where I live now, quite close to Pendle Hill. But it's the town that I grew up in. I was born there, grew up there, lived there till I was about 35, 36, something like that. And it's one of these towns again that was very much involved in the Industrial Revolution. So it's you know, there's a lot of old buildings and stuff. The Shadow Man of Accrington, the reason why I called it that was I had an experience. I'm in my mid-50s now. I'm galloping towards retirement, hopefully. But way back when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I used to work part-time behind a bar. And it was a private members club. And it was situated in a very old, well, it was about 100 years old, just over 100 years old building that was on 3 floors. And it what happened was I was working behind the bar one evening. This is going back, as I said, to sort of like mid 1980s, and I was actually in the bar on my own, and there was a room. The room that the bar was in, there was another room to the left of that. As I stood with my back towards the bar, looking out into the room, there was another room on the left hand side with a sort of serving hatch that went, you know, through from the bar into that other room, and there were snooker tables. I know you guys play pool, so if you imagine, you know, 4 pool tables,
wow,
all together, that's the size of a snooker table roughly. So there was this room with these snooker tables in it, and this serving hatch. And what happened was I was actually stood there. It was quite late on in the evening. There was nobody else in the bar. We hadn't had many customers in at all. It was midweek, and I was basically just watching the clock tick down to the point where I could close the bar and go home. And the only other person that was actually in the building was the guy who sort of looked after the club. We called him. He was the steward of the club. We called them stewards, and he sort of looked after the day-to-day running of the club. Now I knew that he was up on the 3rd floor,
Mhm.
So as I was stood there, I noticed something sort of in the other room through this serving hatch. I saw something moving out of the corner of my eye, and when I turned to look, the only way I can describe it is sort of very tall, thin, shadowy figure that was sort of stooping and looking down towards the serving hatch and sort of leaning through the serving hatch. And I would say this thing was probably, well, I'm over 6 foot tall, and this thing would have towered above me, probably 7, 8 feet tall, something like that. But it was a very shadowy figure, very long, very thin. I remember specifically it was wearing a hat, and it was like a sort of the only way I can describe it, it was like a sort of fedora type hat. And there were no features. There were no. It wasn't wearing any clothing or anything. It was just simply this dark shape, this dark outline that was quite solid, but there was no definition to it at all. And it sort of leaned over, and I could see it put its hands on either side of the bar, and it was leaning through this serving hatch, and it stayed there for probably 3 or 4 seconds, 5 seconds maybe, and then it just disappeared.
Mhm.
So obviously I was really quite, taken aback at this point. And we had an internal phone system. This was in the days before mobile phones. So we had an internal phone system, and I picked up the phone, dialed the third floor, knowing that he was called Bernard, this guy. I knew that he was up there. And he picked the phone up, and I said, can you come down to the bottom floor, please? I said, something really weird's just happened. So he said, yeah, I'll be down in a minute. So anyway, about 30 seconds later, he came down. I could hear him coming down the stairs. And he came into the bar, and he walked in, and he looked at me, and he said, you look like you've seen a ghost. And I said, well, strangely, you should mention that. I think I just have. And he said, oh, all right, you've seen it as well, have you? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, strange shadowy figure in the snooker room. Quite a few people have seen it. He said, I've seen it several times. And he said, there's been people who've worked here over the years whilst I've been here who've seen it, immediately put the coats on, left, and never come back. Now, it didn't have that effect on me because I was more curious as to what it was. And I'd always believed in ghosts. My grandfather used to tell me ghost stories when I was a little boy, so I've always been interested in ghosts. And it was only many years later that I came across a radio station. I think it was Art Bell, actually, and I came across a recording, and he was talking about the shadow people, the Shadow Man or the Hat Man. And it was only at that point that I realised that what I'd seen all those years ago was probably, what we now term this phenomena, which is known as the Shadow Man or the Hat Man. So that was something that stuck with me for a long time, and that really was the sort of genesis of why I wanted to write the book, because obviously I had this story. So I thought, right, okay, well, I've spoken to other people in the past who've told me stories about different experiences they've had. My wife used to live in a very old farmhouse. It dated back to the late 1500s, so it was a very old farmhouse. They had a resident poltergeist. The whole family knew about it. Used to pay particular attention to my sister-in-law, my wife's younger sister. Used to bang on a door in the middle of the night, and she used to shout and tell it to go away, and it would. It'd stop. They used to hear it walking across the floor, slamming doors, moving objects. There was one occasion where Sarah's grandfather, who's no longer with us, but when he was with us, he told me this story several times, where he poured himself a glass of whiskey, and he turned to look at something on the TV, and when he turned back, the whiskey glass was levitating across the room in front of him, and then dropped to the floor. And in fact, Sarah's grandmother was there as well, so she witnessed it as well. So yeah, and they also had electrical problems as well. The electrics used to go off at random times. and Sarah's stepdad had to go down into the cellar and reset all the switches. It was a very old sort of like electrical system, with big fuses and all that sort of thing. But he used to have to go down and reset it all the time. They used to hear these footsteps, particularly on the first floor landing. Now, she said it was strange because it sounded like very heavy boots, hobnail boots, so sort of like metal soles on stone. But upstairs on the landing, it was all wooden floorboards, and it was only after they'd been there a few years, they had to pull all the floorboards up on the first floor because they had dry rot. It was, as I say, it was such an old property. And when they pulled the floorboards up on the landing where they used to hear these footsteps marching up and down, there was actually the original stone floor lintels underneath. So that was quite interesting. And when they were actually selling the farm and moving out, every time somebody came around to actually do a viewing on the farm, all the electrics used to go out. So, wow. Whoever he was, well, they were convinced it was a him. Obviously, didn't want them to leave. So it was sort of stories like that, and many others that I'd sort of collected over the years, and it's something that I've meant to do for a while. But writing a book, is quite a labour-intensive process. And it did take about a year for me to write the first book, slightly less to write the second. But they are just a collection of personal stories. There are stories in there that you will not read anywhere else because, they are very personal stories to people who've never told of their experiences before in a lot of cases. And in, certainly in every case, they haven't been put into print. So that's the first book. That's the Shadow Man of Accrington. The second book, The Black Monks of Accrington, is more of a historical. That's the one. Good timing there. That's sort of more of a historical account of, again, the area around Accrington, the town that I was born and lived in. And many of the local stories. Again, there are some eyewitness accounts that, basically haven't been published before, from people who've had various experiences in and around the area, and certainly some of the more famous ghost stories and legends and so on. People have contacted me with their own experiences of those, which sort of backs up the stories to a certain degree. So again, it's a very interesting book. I think there's some very interesting stories in there, and again, the stories that you wouldn't find anywhere else.
Now, when you write these books, do you also research the history on the place, and how do you do that? Because the records go back, way far. So, are you talking to people, or are there archives somewhere, or how's that work?
Yeah, well, both really. There are a lot of historical records, going back many hundreds of years. That are a lot of stuff's available on the internet now. There is stuff in the local reference libraries, local research libraries. So I've actually been to look at sort of hard documents, if you like, original documents, and also just speaking to people that I know, people who've contacted me through either my website or social media, or have heard my podcast, and just approached me with their own stories. But interestingly, you talk about records. Our records of all sorts of stuff go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And in fact, one of my other hobbies, which is a little bit different to this, is actually genealogy. And I've traced my family tree on both sides of the families back hundreds and hundreds of years. And in fact, on my mother's side of the family, I can actually trace my family tree all the way back to William the Conqueror. So that's that's how he's actually my 36th great grandfather. So I am related to the royal family distantly, but in fact I've probably got more of a claim on the royal family than the current king has, because I am actually descended from the Plantagenet kings and not the German kings like the lot we've got in a minute.
Like they are now, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, our records do go back hundreds and hundreds of years, and certainly there are a lot of records about the local towns and cities because, as I say, because of the Industrial Revolution and everything that went with it. There are a lot of archival documents that are online, and we can go and see at the local libraries. So it's a combination really of actually doing hard research and also talking to people and getting sort of on the ground personal experiences that people have had.
Well, when people over here don't grasp how old things are where you're at, because I mean, right now I'm in the process of reading a book every Sunday about the Salem witch trials, which was the late 1600s. But that's nothing to you. That's
well,
you guys go way back.
Yeah, I mean, we can go back further than that. I mean, obviously it does get a little bit sketchy the further back we go, but yeah, I mean, the Salem witch trials were not that much later than the Pendle witch trials, which we had over here. And in fact, there are quite a lot of similarities, I think, between the two sets of circumstances that unfortunately, on in both stories meant that there were people being persecuted, and certainly in the Pendle witch cases, they were executed for crimes that they probably didn't do. But I'm actually really interested by the Salem witch trials. I think it's something that I need to do a little bit more research on, because there are an awful lot of similarities, which I think is really interesting. I think it was very much the attitudes of people at the time, and obviously there were a lot of people coming, going over from England, especially to the new colonies, as they were at the time, and obviously taking their religious beliefs along with them. And a lot of the hysteria that surrounded witches in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries were very much, religious in Genesis. So they were very much religious. What's the word I'm looking for? They were born out of religious beliefs.
Tell me a little bit about the Pendleton witches.
Well, the Pendle witches.
I'm sorry, Pendle witches.
No, it's okay. Strangely enough, there is actually
one of those days already. You can tell.
No, it's okay. There is actually a small village called Pendleton, which is very close to Pendle, actually. Okay. So that's interesting. Pendle witches. It's a very complicated story. It's a very complex story. I try to keep it as simple as possible when I'm talking to people about it, because we could talk for 2 hours, 3 hours about it. Basically, it was it happened in 1612. It started off in the area where I live here. As I say, I live very close to a place called Pendle Hill. It was basically two families, two local families who were very poor. They had a very poor existence. They were peasants in effect, and one of the families. It had basically been a sort of feud going on between these two families for quite a while, and I think that eventually sort of stoked a lot of the accusations and counter accusations that were being made against various members of the families. The two sort of main protagonists really were the two oldest women in both families. One went by the name of Demdike, Old Demdike. The other one was Anne Whittle, who was also known as Old Chattox. And they were basically interviewed various members of the family both families were interviewed following an incident where a local tradesman believed that he had a sort of spell put on him by one of the younger grandchildren of Anne Whittle, one of the granddaughters. They'd been out begging on the road, and this particular merchant, actually a guy called John Law, was coming from the neighbouring county of Yorkshire. We are quite close to the border with Yorkshire here, and he had encountered Anne Whittle and her granddaughter, Anne Redfern, and they asked him to buy some pins, I think, or something along those lines, and he refused. And the granddaughter allegedly put a curse on him, and within about 20 yards of him riding off down the road on his horse, he actually, what people now believe was either a stroke or a heart attack, but he basically had some sort of fit and fell off his horse. And he was taken to a local inn where he recounted, he was still awake. He recounted that he'd had this curse put on him by young Redfern. And from there, it just spiraled out of control. The local magistrate, who was a guy called Roger Nowell, got involved. He was very much a believer in the teachings of the beliefs of the king at the time, who was King James I, James VI of Scotland. He'd succeeded Elizabeth I, because obviously, as you know, Elizabeth I had died without any heirs. So he was the nearest in line for the English throne, even though he was the King of Scotland as well. But he was obsessed with witchcraft. He believed that that there were witches everywhere, basically. He believed that people who didn't attend church were closet witches. He believed that there was witchcraft going on all across the country. He believed that he'd actually been very close to death a couple of years after he came to the English throne. He was crossing the North Sea, coming from Denmark in a boat with his soon-to-be new bride, and they actually encountered a very bad storm, which almost sank the ship, and he blamed that on witches. He believed that the storm had been caused by witchcraft, and he wrote a book called Demonology, which was all about his beliefs around witchcraft and what he expected his followers, the people who also believed in his beliefs, what he expected them to do. He explained how to root out a witch, how to find a witch, how to get confessions out of them, and so on. And Roger Nowell was a local magistrate. He wanted to further his career, obviously. He wanted to basically get into James I's good books in order, to be able to be invited to court in London. The poor guy was stuck up here in the middle of nowhere. In the 17th century, Lancashire was probably not the nicest place to live. A sort of backwater of the country, really, very sparsely populated. So he was probably trying to curry favour with the king. So when he saw this opportunity to interrogate these two families, and the members of these families, and he managed to extract some very bizarre confessions, various things such as causing death of people by making what they claimed were clay figures, and then crumbling them and throwing them into the fire, and therefore causing the death of the person that they were supposed to represent. Cannibalism was another one that they were accused of, being in league with the devil, having familiars. So one of the, I think it was Chattox, said that she had the devil used to come to her in the form of a black dog, and used to suck blood from her, and all this sort of thing. So there was some, they were turning milk sour and turning ale sour and all sorts of stuff, if people didn't, give them what they wanted. And there were a lot of accusations and counter accusations, and eventually there were about 12 of them were taken to a place called Lancaster, which was the sort of county main town. There is a castle at Lancaster, which is it dates back to about 12th century, something like that. If you look online, if you go on Wikipedia or something like that, just put Lancaster Castle. It's a fascinating place, really is. And they used to hold the trials there, the local assizes, as they used to call them. And that's where they stood trial, and they were all convicted of witchcraft, and they were all hanged. So all apart from Demdike, who actually died in the cells while they were waiting for the trial. They were put in the cells for about 3 or 4 months before they actually went to trial. And they were. I've seen the cells. I've actually been to the castle and had a look at the dungeons. You can just imagine how bad the conditions must have been. And so she died before they went to trial. She was one of the elder women. She was in her 80s. So you can imagine, it was must have been quite a difficult thing to endure. But yeah, they were all hanged, all convicted of witchcraft and hanged. So, and the interesting thing is that one of the main witnesses for the prosecution for Roger Nowell was a 7-year-old girl. Now she was called Jeanette Device, and she was the daughter, or actually she was the granddaughter of Demdike, the daughter of Elizabeth Device, who was another one of the family who were convicted and hanged for witchcraft. And it actually the evidence of this little girl who was 7 years of age was crucial, really, to convicting them all. So you can just imagine the scenes in the courtroom with this little girl stood on a table, throwing wild accusations at a family, a mother, her brothers, a grandmother, and everybody else that was there as well. So quite bizarre, really. There is a record of the trial. The clerk to the court, a person called Thomas Potts, actually wrote a book about it after the trials. So his recollection of what went on. So it is the only source we've got. It is the only written source. So we can, we probably have to take a lot of what he writes in the book probably with a pinch of salt, simply because, again, he was trying to curry favour with the king. And he actually dedicated the book to one of James I's lieutenants, a guy called Thomas Knivett. And interestingly, Thomas Knivett was one of the soldiers who discovered the gunpowder plot in 1605. So he was one of the soldiers who discovered Guy Fawkes underneath the Houses of Parliament. So yeah, very anti-Catholic as well. There was an awful lot of persecution of the Catholics at the time, and that's obviously where the gunpowder plot comes into it. But because a lot of these people who were accused of witchcraft were probably Catholic as well. They didn't go to church. They sort of had secret mass and all that sort of thing. So again, that was very much a factor in their demise. So it's a very famous case. It's people have since really sort of investigated and done research into, especially what Thomas Potts wrote, and various other contemporary trials that went on at the same time, and it's widely regarded really as one of the greatest miscarriages of justice really in the English legal system. And we've got some over the years that have been pretty bad, but this is the Pendle witches, and the trial is probably the worst.
Well, I was just thinking while you were talking, you talked about the 7-year-old girl. Salem witch trial, similar stuff. 14-year-old girl is making the accusations, and they actually jailed a little girl that was 4 or 5 years old as a witch.
Yeah,
that's insane.
There was. I mean, there were what we will class as minors now, so children under the age of 16, who were accused of witchcraft and hanged. Age really had nothing to do with it in those days. It didn't matter how young you were. If you were accused and found guilty of a crime, obviously in this case, we're talking about witchcraft, but it could be any crime really. They if they were sentenced to death, then that's what would happen.
Well, when you start researching the Salem witch trials, you'll see some really bizarre things. I mean, this book has just totally blown me away that I'm reading. About how trumped up it was, how they were all in cahoots, and all this was going on, and it was so obvious it was trumped up, but yet they kept going and going and going until they got the convictions.
Yeah, I mean, with the Pendle witch trials, there was definitely a case of what a lot of the confessions they were making that they actually probably believed themselves. I think it was a combination really of ignorance and lack of education, and probably a lack of understanding of the seriousness of the situation that they were in. But you have to remember that these people, especially the matriarchs of the family, they were well known locally as being sort of healing women. They were the people to go to if you lived in the village and you were ill, because they were the ones that could conjure up make a potion of local herbs and plants and tree bark and that sort of thing, which would hopefully cure you. And that's how they made a living. They used to do this for payment. They were known locally as wise women, and they were probably seen as a bit of a threat to by the authorities, especially when they were actively seeking witches. Old women, the archetypal witch that we think of now on a broomstick and with a pointy hat and a cauldron and all that. So actually that's not what it was like at all. That's actually a construct of Hollywood. And sort of Disney and Snow White and all that sort of thing, that they sort of made this this image of what they believed a witch should look like, when in fact these witches, in inverted commas, these wise women were just normal peasant women who just understood how to use the local resources in order to be able to help heal people, and that had been going on for centuries, hundreds of probably thousands of years.
Every society has them. Tell me about the black monks.
Well, this is related again to Accrington. There was an abbey built in about the 12th century, and this was when the town of Accrington as it is now didn't exist. It was just a sort of small farming community. It wasn't until about 1700 when it started becoming industrialized. It was a cotton weaving town really during the 18th, 19th centuries. But the legend of the Black Monks is quite interesting. The abbey was built in about, as I said, about the well, actually it was the 11th century. Beg your pardon. The 11th century, and it actually it burnt down. It was the records show that it was actually arson by some of the local farmers who were not happy that the monks had built this abbey and had started to take over the land around it. So the farming land that these peasant farmers lived on at the time, the monks were actually stealing the land off them, fencing it off and using it for their own usage. So the local farmers took exception to this, as you would, and according to records, burnt the abbey down. And there were 3 monks were caught inside the abbey and died as it burnt down. And the legend is that the ghostly figures of these 3 monks are seen in the area where the abbey used to stand. There's actually a road in Accrington called Black Abbey Street, and it's the site of where the abbey was, and it's called Black Abbey Street because of the charred, blackened remains of the abbey that were left behind. And there's been numerous sightings over the years of these monks. In fact, I had an email from a guy when I was researching the book. He actually heard me on a local radio station. And I just, sort of said, if anybody's got any stories, please get in contact with me. So he did. He emailed me, and he'd actually had an encounter with this black hooded ghostly figure one morning whilst he was actually making his way to work, and he was actually crossing some old disused railway tracks, and he saw this figure in the distance very early in the morning. He said it was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and it was just coming light, and he was walking down along these tracks as he always did every morning, and he saw this figure in the distance. And he said as he got closer and closer, he said he thought that it resembled somebody who was wearing like a monk's habit. So it had a hood up and a long sort of cloak tied around the middle. And he said he got close enough to it to sort of notice really that there was no face. It was just a black void where the face should be. And he said it just disappeared in front of him. So he was obviously quite shaken up by that. But there have been numerous sightings over the years, and in fact, there's a police station which is built very close to the site of the abbey, and it's a disused police station now, but the building is still standing. And there are actually local ghost hunting groups who regularly go in, because there is an awful lot of paranormal activity happens in this building. And they have seen several times figures of monks walking through the building. So that, as I say, is on it's on the area where the abbey originally was. So that's quite interesting. So there have been quite a number of sightings over the years. And there's a local legend which goes back way back to when I was nothing but a young lad, about a young girl who fell in love with one of the monks, and when her brother found out, him and his friends waited in secret for them when they were meeting, and actually killed one of these monks in front of her. And obviously she was absolutely distraught by this. And the legend is that her ghost is often seen on Black Abbey Street, and she's usually seen holding her arms up in the air, waving her arms in the air, screaming in absolute agony, the fact that she's just seen her lover be killed in front of her. And there are reports, and this is quite interesting. There are reports that if you approach her and you get close enough to her, she actually bursts into flames, which is quite interesting given the fact that she's not actually connected with the burning down of the abbey. So, although I have spoken to people who claim to have seen this actually happen, which is quite interesting. So, I think that's a good example actually of how sometimes legends can sort of become intertwined with each other and sort of create their own legend. But yeah, she's been seen. She's very, very, very famous in the area and has been seen on a number of occasions.
What's it like for you, knowing what you know about the area And let's say you decide to take an evening stroll or a night walk. What's it like for you just to be out, knowing that maybe they're watching or whatever's going on?
Well, it's great. I mean, I love this area. It's as I said at the beginning of the video. It's
Uh-huh.
it's a beautiful area. It's very rural, so we've got a lot of very secluded country lanes and fields and moors and hills and rivers and all every type of landscape really you can think of on the doorstep.
Uh-huh.
And there are a lot of local legends, a lot of local ghost stories. Again, they're in both books
Uh-huh.
about this particular area, so around Pendle Hill, and the area around ghostly figures. Um, Lots of big cat sightings. We do have a bit of a thing going on around here at the minute with big cat sightings, which is interesting. Obviously, that's moving away from the paranormal a little bit, but there's also a lot of UFO activity as well, which I sort of touched on in both books.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, Pendle Hill is an area where there have been numerous reports of UFO activities over the years. So it's a very interesting area, and it's just great to explore. It's a sort of place where you can just talk to people, and they will tell you the stories. They will tell you, local legends that you maybe haven't heard before, or ghost stories that you haven't heard before. And there are some absolute cracking ghost stories, really just outside my front door. So I am very, very lucky.
What is one of the more scarier stories?
One of the more scariest stories. There's the story of there's a river very close to where I live, and there's a road bridge goes over it. And I was told a story by somebody who lives quite close to me that his uncle was down fishing on the river very early one morning, and he noticed that there was a woman and a child walking across the fields towards him and towards the river, and he thought it was quite strange because it was very early in the morning. There was nobody else about. He hadn't seen anybody all morning, and he said that it was also very strange because he didn't expect to see somebody walking across the fields, because there were no footpaths across this field.
Mhm.
So it wasn't, you wouldn't normally see people just walking across the field. They'd stick to footpaths and roads and that sort of thing. And he said as she got closer, he noticed that she was wearing quite old-fashioned clothing. He said it looked almost sort of Victorian in the way that she was dressed.
Mhm.
And he said that his uncle told him that, to his astonishment, when this woman and this little girl got to the edge of the riverbank, they just carried on walking across in thin air. And they just crossed the river in thin air and carried on across on the far bank, and then just sort of disappeared into the distance. And this was very close to where there is a road bridge now. Now, the interesting thing is, I did some research on this, and again, there's the this research is in the book. That before the road bridge was built, the road bridge was built in 1930, and it's obviously a stone road bridge. Now, the river at that particular point is always flooding. It's always bursting its banks, and there used to be a wooden footbridge where that particular stone road bridge is now. I've seen photographs of it dating back to the 1920s. And this wooden footbridge was the only way to cross the river at that point. And of course, because the river flooded on a regular basis, especially during the winter, because we get an awful lot of rain around here, especially in winter, it was always being washed away. And so eventually they decided that they were going to going to build a stone bridge, which obviously can withstand the floods better. But at the time, the wooden footbridge was the only way across. And he was convinced that where he saw this figure of this woman and this little girl crossing the river is where the old footbridge, the old wooden footbridge used to be. So that's quite interesting.
It is, and I was just thinking too. See, every time you say stuff, I come up with stuff. I've been on investigations in like old buildings with psychics, and it's funny because they get so into what they're doing that I guess they see it like it was, kind of like you're talking about this footbridge. And I've actually seen psychics literally walk into walls because there was a door there before in this building, way back.
Yeah.
So yeah, that story about them walking across the river, like that's totally believable to me.
Yeah. And another one which is a little less scary, but it's just as fascinating. There was a guy who was walking from the next village, which is a couple of miles away, and he was walking to the village where I live to meet a friend of his in the pub. We have 2 pubs in the village, and he was meeting one of his friends one night. And this particular night, it was absolutely throwing it down with rain, middle of winter, pitch black, really horrible night. And he walked the couple of miles from where he lived into the village and went into the pub, met his friend, and his friend was quite concerned when he saw him because not only was he absolutely drip wet through, but he actually looked quite scared. And when he asked him what was wrong, he said, "Well, when I was walking, because it's as I say, it's very, very rural countryside out here. So he was walking down very dimly lit road, very dark, for a couple of miles. He said he was convinced that something or somebody was following him. And he'd done this walk hundreds of times, never had that feeling at all before. He said he was very unnerved. And so he got himself a very stiff drink, as we say over here. And he was just trying to calm himself down. And there was a woman stood at the bar, and she tapped him on the shoulder and she said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but where's your dog gone?" And he looked at her and he said, "I haven't got a dog." And she said, "Well, one walked in with you when you came in."
Wow. Oh,
So,
that's cool. That's
yeah,
really cool.
yes, that's quite cool. Yeah, I like that one. I like that story because I'm a dog lover. You see, we have dogs, so
Right.
and unfortunately, we lost one a couple of weeks ago. So, so I like to think that he's still around in some form.
That is really cool. Which story would you say is your most favorite out of everything you've been told?
In the first book, there's a story that I was contacted by a lady who used to live in a very haunted house, and there were a number of entities in this house, particularly violent, some of them. I won't go into too much detail because I think it's better if people buy the book and read it.
Right.
It is a really interesting story.
Absolutely.
But again, it was historical. It was to do with a coal mining disaster, which had happened close to where she lived, and it turned out that there were disused mine shafts that were, one of them went underneath the road that she lived on. And her house was the particular epicenter of this paranormal activity, which involved the usual slamming doors, heavy footsteps, but it became worse when a kitchen knife, for instance, was thrown at her son, narrowly missed her son. And she employed a medium to go into the house and to try and establish, who was there, how many people were there, and what she came up with, what she managed to contact these spirits was really interesting. And again, looking through historical records, it completely matches what this medium had said. She came out with a number of names and quite a few historical incidents that made sense as to why this property was haunted in such a way. But she was. They lived there for quite a few years, but she said towards the end the paranormal activity was so bad that they actually just had to move out. So yeah, that's a really interesting story, and there was some quite scary, hair-raising things that she said, about their experiences, what they'd had to live through, and that. So yeah, that's probably one of my favourite stories. But I've got loads of favourite stories. There's just so many really that it's difficult to pinpoint one which is the most famous. I think that one's the most intriguing. Let's put it that way.
Sounds like it, absolutely. So what's next for you?
Well, I'm still doing the podcast. I took a little bit of time off from doing the podcast last year for personal reasons. My mum passed away last year, and I had a bit of a difficult time. But I'm back on with the podcast now, so I've got quite a lot of guests lined up for the next 2 or 3 months. Actually, I'm fairly booked up actually, which is nice. I'm doing some research for a third book. It's going to be a little bit different to the 2 that I've written, but it's still going to be very much based around the sort of county of Lancashire. But it's going to focus a little bit on different types of paranormal activity, different types of hauntings, different areas, shall we say, rather than your sort of archetypal haunted house or haunted castle, or it's going to be something a little bit different. So I won't go into too much about that at the minute, but I'm doing some research into that. So hopefully I'll start writing that at some point this year.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was
you.
Wonderful. Love to have you on again. Oh my gosh, I could talk for hours about this stuff.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. I don't honestly get to speak to many people from across the pond. It's always a pleasure to speak to people such as yourself, because you do have a passion over there for the paranormal, which I think is great. And just to mention as well, I'm actually there's going to be a series on Amazon, and I'm not sure whether it'll be shown in America or not. It's certainly be shown over here in the UK sometime in the spring. I still haven't got an actual name for it or when it's going to be broadcast, but it's a 6-part series on the paranormal, of which I was interviewed and filmed along with some other guests as well. So just keep your eyes open for that. My TV debut.
That sounds fantastic. Well, once again, thank you so much. And where can people find you, sir?
Probably the best place to go actually is my website, which is craigbryant.co.uk. And that's got links to Amazon for the books. The books are only available on Amazon. Also links to the podcast as well. So if people want to have a listen to the podcast, there's about 30 odd episodes on there, cover everything from the paranormal to UFOs, to cryptozoology. So yeah, there's quite a big range of stuff. And yeah, it's always growing is the website. There's quite a lot of stuff on there at the minute. So that's probably the best place to start.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening. And I really appreciate you coming on.
And I appreciate you asking me on. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
All right, sir. Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, well, sorry to cut him off early. I'm going too fast on that trigger. What a great bunch of stories, and what a great collection of stuff. So I hope you guys buy those books. Buy those books, from Amazon. Fantastic. Anyway, tomorrow, I don't know who my guest is tomorrow, but we'll be back at 6:30 p.m. Pacific, and usual time. And you guys can check out the shows. We're going to have a great lineup of shows this week. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Craig for coming on again. I apologize for cutting him off like I did. That's what I get for pushing the buttons. And again, if you like what you see tonight and you're watching from Facebook, please be sure to hit that like and follow. Whether you're on my personal page or you're on the California Haunts Ghost Events page. If you're watching from YouTube, right down there, that little ghost, click on that. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. We've got over 490 videos sitting over there. Now, probably closer to 500 videos. Kind of cool. We're going to have a big anniversary show. But so I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I appreciate it. And if you like the show, share it with 5 people. If you hated the show, share it with 5 of your enemies. We're equal opportunity here at California Haunts Radio. We just want to get that word out about the show, and you guys are doing a fantastic job. Believe me, you're doing a fantastic job. Okay, well, that being said, I'm going to call it a night, and I really appreciate you all coming, and I'll see you tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Pacific. Here we go. I'll give you his contact information, and off we go. Website, craigbryant.co.uk, and his podcast is anchor.fm/Craig-Bryant3. The books are The Black Monks of Accrington, and The Shadow Man of Accrington. And as he said, the best place to get those books is, of course, Amazon. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.